Hello and welcome back to another historical knitting video. It's been a while since my last one and I'm really excited to show all the progress that I've made since then and also welcome you to my new apartment. I actually finally have a room just for crafting, so I'm really excited about everything that's happened since the last time I posted. I'm also joined by my dog here, Nutella. She's quite big, so you might not see her face the whole time, but she just wants to relax up here with me while I do this. So as most of you probably know, I've been working on creating an entire 1890s outfit by hand, and I'm trying to mostly hand knit it. So far I've completed my stockings, the combinations, the trimming for my corset, the underskirt, my bustle pad, and the first portion of my petticoat. At this point, it's time for me to actually add the last bits to the bottom of my petticoat. In part 1, I had finished the truly Victorian pattern all the way up to adding the last lace ruffle trim to the bottom. And I actually decided to deviate a little bit from the truly Victorian pattern based on the historical references that I found. And the one in particular that I was being inspired by had a flounce and then a set of tucks, insertion lace, another set of tucks, and then lace trim at the bottom. So that's what I would like to do. So I'm going to add a set of insertion lace and a set of tucks that the original truly Victorian pattern didn't have. Also in the meantime, since it hasn't been a few weeks, I have done a little bit more digging into historical references, and one thing that I found was that there are actually petticoats out there from approximately the time period that do have hand knit lace trim or insertion, and that made me really excited because while I do sometimes have to take some liberties due to cost or time constraints, it was really exciting to see that people in that time period did actually use knit lace trims and insertions on their petticoats. The other place that I went to that I hadn't before was actually my set of original 1890s delineator magazines, which were a set of fashion magazines from the time. So the first magazine that I'm going to reference is actually the 1892 copy of the Delineator from June. And in it you will see this particular petticoat, which while the top and it's hard to tell what's at the back don't look very similar, what is really exciting to me is I can see that there's a flounce and then a set of lace insertion, another set of fabric, and then the lace trim at the bottom. Now, I know that this doesn't have any tucks, but I will say that it seems like tucks were very common at the time, so I think that that's still something that's very reasonable for us to add and have on the petticoat that I'm making. The second magazine that I have, which is also a delineator, is from September 1890, so September the same year, and that also has an image for a petticoat pattern. And this one actually looks a lot like the truly Victorian pattern. It has the gathers in the back with a drawstring waist, then it has the tucks and the lace trim at the bottom. So it's very, very close to the truly Victorian pattern and is also a great reference, like many of the other references that I had for sewing this petticoat. The last step in this process is for me to actually choose which knit lace insertion and trim I'm going to do. So I actually went back to the book I've been using this entire time, which is an original 1892 copy of The Art of Knitting, which was also published by the same publisher that published the Delineator magazines. So what's kind of fun is at the back of the Delineator magazines, they always published every month a few knitting patterns, and then when they created this book, they actually gathered together all of those different knitting patterns and published it in this book with some knitting instructions in the front. So it's kind of neat, because I can see the buildup of all the patterns, and I own delineators past 1892, so I can see some other knitting patterns that aren't included in this particular book. So I actually began by picking a knit trim. This one in particular here stood out to me because it has a scalloped edge, where the other ones that I found had more pointed edges. So this one really stood out. And then I decided to pick a knit insertion to go along with that lace trim. I didn't want to spend too long knitting, so I decided to go for an insertion that didn't look quite so complicated, but I thought would also complement the trim. So I chose this one, which I thought looked pretty simple and had like a nice open hole diamond pattern. That's what you'll see me doing in this video, is knitting those two pieces of lace. Not just pieces, that's 14.5 feet of lace each, so 29 feet of lace. as well as assembling the rest of the petticoat and then trying on the outfit that I have so far. Wish me luck. So for creating both the insertion lace and the lace trim, I decided to use just a generic cotton yarn in a bit of an off-white color. I just got the yarn from my local craft store, and that does make it quite thick. I think it's just around worsted weight. It's a lot thicker than I think would have been used in the 1890s, but I did have 29 feet of lace to make, so I didn't want to necessarily spend ages trying to knit up all the lace. So I made a bit of an exception and I used a slightly thicker yarn than might have been done in the 1890s. I finished the first repeat of the lace trim. I really like how it turned out with a flower pattern on the left and the start of a bit of a diagonal on the right. When I was knitting this up, I was thinking about how I was going to block this. So I did know that I wanted to block the lace just because I think that it opens up the details quite nicely. However, with maybe knitting this all as one piece of 14.5 feet, I wasn't exactly sure that I had enough blocking materials or room in my apartment to actually be able to do that. So I decided to knit it in 4 pieces to match up with the 4 sections of my petticoat so I could sew it on at the end quite well. Unfortunately, as I was knitting up this lace, I did make quite a few mistakes. If I caught them early enough on, I would tink back or frog back and re-knit that particular section. I will say, after I finished each lace piece and I looked it over, there were some mistakes that were missed, but I think it gives it a little bit extra character and is proof that it was hand knit rather than, machine knit or something like that. So it's my own little Easter egg in my lace knitting. In order to reach the full length that I needed, or about 44 inches per section, for the lace trim, I had to make 22 repeats of the pattern. And I timed myself when I was making this, and it took me about 6 hours to knit one section of the pattern. And here you can see that I'm finishing off this particular lace portion, 1/4 of it, and it always feels good to finish off that last stitch and pull through. And I had to do this 3 more times. So you can see here's the first section that I knit, and then I knit 3 more of the exact same pattern with 22 repeats. And this represents, because there's 4 of them, that represents about 24 hours of work. Straight, not, one day's work, but straight knitting work, 24 hours of knitting work, in order to create the 14.5 feet needed to trim the bottom of my petticoat. I also knit the insertion lace in quite a similar way using the complementing pattern. I cast on fewer stitches for the insertion lace. It wasn't quite as wide, and each repeat itself actually was wider than one repeat of the insertion lace. So you can see here that the diamonds are spaced slightly further apart in this lace pattern than they are in the lace trim. So instead of having to do 22 repeats of this pattern to reach the 44 inches, I actually only needed 18 repeats in order to reach the width. I also timed myself to see how long it took me to finish 1/4 of the trim that I had, or one section of lace that I was doing, and it was also about 6 hours. The reason being is that I personally found this lace pattern to be less intuitive, or it was a little bit more difficult for me to follow and remember than the lace trim, so I had to work at it slightly slower than I did for the lace trim. So for this one, I think it took me about 3 full sections before I could knit the pattern mostly without looking at the instructions, whereas with the lace trim, I could do it about halfway through the first knitting section. So once again, the best feeling ever, finishing off one of these lace sections. That's 6 hours of knitting work that I'm finally able to cast off. And I also knit 3 more of these, so another approximately 24 hours of knitting time to finish this. And then I also had the lace trims to all 4 sections together. And so the lace insertion and the lace trim together represent about 48 hours to 50 hours of work in total. That's a lot of knitting. I was very, very glad to be finished. Now it was time for the exciting moment of actually blocking my lace. For this, I decided to wet block it because I did need it to stretch quite a bit in order to match the length of the petticoat that I needed. So instead of steam blocking it, I wet blocked it. Then I laid it out on a towel, and this is the way. I just wanted to show you my method for squeezing out the excess moisture. I used my own weight to kind of drive out the moisture in a towel that's rolled up nice and tight. Don't worry, I'm holding on to something for support so I don't fall over while I'm doing this. And of course, my dog Nutella always loves to help. In order to block the lace, I actually bought blocking materials, so some blocking mats, and I think they're called blocking combs, and some pins. Of course, it wasn't enough. This required a lot of pinning down, so I grabbed whatever pins I could find to really open it up and stretch it out. It did take quite some time to do this, however, I think it was really worth it. Of course, I needed the width of the lace to be stretched to its final length, but I also think that it really brought out the pattern as well of the lace. And as always, Nutella had to be involved in the action. She thought the pins were a little bit pokey, but she wanted to know exactly what was going on. At this point, I decided to measure out my petticoat just to see how long everything would be. The petticoat is, I think, about 32 inches long, and then each lace section is about 3 to 4 inches long, and the pin tucks are about 4 inches long because I wanted to have the insertion lace and then a section of pin tucks and then the trim at the bottom. I really should have done this measuring before knitting the lace trim because I think this skirt will end up being somewhere between 39 and 41 inches long, which, while I do believe it was actually a length possible to buy at the time from the fashion catalog that I found, however, on my size, my height, I think that this skirt is going to hit a little bit too low for what would have been usually worn. I am, however, very proud of my new sewing abilities. They aren't much improved, but I took a lot of the suggestions that you guys gave me last time, and I think I was able to create slightly more straight lines when I was sewing together the sections to create these pin tucks. So I decided to create 3 pin tucks in between the insertion lace and the lace trim at the bottom to kind of mimic the look of the petticoat that I was trying to recreate. I also followed the fantastic piece of advice that one of you gave me, which is to iron my seams flat and also use a little bit of ironing to help me when I sew the tucks. And I think it improved the skirt so much, and it improved my sewing by quite a significant margin. So thank you so much. Once again, I really, really appreciate all the feedback that I get from you all in the comments. I think that it's made my end product so much better. The other great point is, after moving, I have an entire room dedicated to crafting, which means that I can actually sit at a table and sew without completely breaking my back, unlike you saw in my last video in part 1 where I was sitting crouched over on the floor. And like I said, I'm creating 3 more tucks, so I had to sew all the way around the skirt 3 more times. While these tucks aren't particularly straight or even, I do think that after ironing them flat, they're an improvement on my first set of tucks on the skirt that I did before. So I'm happy. There's always room for improvement though. I also think that my lace trim is done with being blocked, so I'm undoing the pins, and then it's time to block the insertion lace. Since I only have 1 set of blocking mats, I had to do one after the other. I also wish that I would have had more blocking combs, just because the edges are straight lines and the blocking combs really allow you to get those straight lines correct, rather than the pins, which add a little bit of waves to your edges. However, it ended up working out fine, and then it was time to do the most nerve-wracking bit, which is actually sewing the insertion lace to the bottom of my petticoat. As you can see, I was pretty hesitant in doing the sewing in this first bit, just because I wanted to make sure that it looked good and actually balanced well, but in the end I decided to just get it done, and I do think it turned out quite well. So I checked it every once in a while, and of course I still have to weave together the ends between the sections of the lace, but I do think that it looks quite nice. So here you can see this is where I have to weave together the ends, and oh boy, those first tucks are quite uneven. But after laying out how the petticoat looks with the insertion lace, the extra row of tucks, and then the lace on the bottom, I do think that the overall effect is going to be really nice, and you know, definitely looks like it was inspired by the petticoat that I've been looking at in the fashion magazine. So then I sewed the extra 3 tucks to the insertion lace and added the lace trim to the bottom of those new 3 tucks. And I was then done with the entire skirt. I wove in the ends and connected the lace pieces together, and I think that it looks pretty great already just laying down. And I was really excited to put everything on and really see how the skirt felt as I was wearing it. And here I am, wearing my completed petticoat. I am so excited with how it all looks and how it all came together. I really loved being able to put on the finished petticoat. I will say it's quite heavy, especially with the lace added at the bottom. The one criticism I could have for this for myself, or the biggest one that I have, is just that it's probably not as delicate as originally intended. So I would definitely use a thinner yarn if I had a lot more time to do a lot more delicate knitting. But as you can see, I can't stop twirling in this petticoat, and I'm really happy with how my outfit looks so far. I'm really close to finishing putting together all the undergarments, and I get to start sewing on the finished dress soon. I did get a comment asking me if I was going to make a corset cover, and I'm currently a little bit on the fence, so please let me know. Should I make a corset cover before I start actually sewing the dress components, or should I go straight to sewing the dress components? And also kind of give me your thoughts on whether or not I should maybe put in 1 extra tuck on this petticoat to take up the skirt hem by another inch. I do think this skirt is a little bit long on me, so let me know what you think. Overall, if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a like. If you want to see me as I continue on my sewing journey for this 1890s project, please feel free to subscribe, and I will see you again next time. Thank you so much for watching.